Join me on an inspiring journey through the world of fitness, health, and performance with the Genetic Coach, where I delve deep into the genetic foundations of athletic endurance, discovering how genetics is revolutionizing our understanding of human potential and how we can unlock our full athletic capabilities through a fresh perspective on conventional practices. Hello and welcome back to the Genetic Coach. I'm Di White, and we are back again talking about all things genetic and how it influences our training and our recovery and how we think about injury. Last week, we started the conversation about recovery, particularly how genetics can help us discover how we can make our recovery practices much more targeted and more intuitive. And you'll remember that we had Chantelle, our resident 3x4 expert on training with genetics, highlighting the reasons why we all recover at different rates. And specifically, we spoke about what this means for our training methods and how we should be structuring our workouts within our training regimes, as well as the role of nutrition in enhancing our unique recovery processes. It was a super interesting talk, and we were meant to get into injury as well, but we ran out of time, which perhaps was a good thing, as I definitely think lumping them together, injury and recovery, was probably a disservice to both. So we will be, definitely revisiting recovery in a follow-up episode. There's so much more to explore on the topic of recovery, both in terms of actual lifestyle interventions, but also in terms of nutrition. So please don't think that we are done with it and we are not going to be going back to it. We definitely will be looking at it from various different perspectives in the future. But for now and for today, we are jumping into injury. And I was starting to look at it, and I just had some thoughts around some of my own injury woes that I've experienced, going through bouts of injury as well with some of the athletes that I coach. So I'm fully aware of the distress that injury causes and the new dynamic that it creates in somebody's life when they have to deal with injury. And there's obviously the pain and discomfort of the actual injury, but there's also the money spent on treatment and rehab. And then if we think further down the line, there's obviously the time off training, which for many means a complete disruption to everyday routine. And then on top of that, we have spiraling depression as one watches fitness disappear, as well as probably the loss of social interactions from training partners, training groups, clubs, and then linked to that would be the loss of mental and physical stress relief that a lot of people experience when exercising. And then, we all, when it comes down to the bottom line, is spending money, and injury is expensive. There's time spent on rehab, which obviously costs the money, and then, preparing for an event, you've been sacrificing time and money to prepare for an event, and now there's obviously the potential of missing out on this event. And how does that affect you mentally when you've prepared so hard and made sacrifices along the way, and now all of a sudden you're not able to compete or participate? So yes, injury is a big topic, and I think, for the elites and the sponsored athletes, the distress must be multiplied by 10, as the losses are just amplified so much more. And so the stakes are often very high, and that's, it's all relative, because regardless of your level, there's some kind of loss that is linked to injury. When I think of injury and how people deal with it, I think a lot of the time with endurance athletes, there's kind of this premise of just toughen up. You just need to push through it. You can't let it get to you. Ignore it, and it'll get better. And I think that's what, in most cases, endurance athletes do. They ignore a niggle instead of giving it the attention it deserves, and then they often land up with a full-blown chronic injury. And I know that from my experience, my personal experience, that's exactly the case, where something has started to cause some discomfort. And I think, well, can't let it get to me. I've got this, I've got that, I've got this event that I'd like to do. I'm sure it will just go away, and it obviously doesn't. So thinking about just some high-profile athletes that have recently been in the news that paint a picture of this kind of phenomenon. I think of first the top triathlete, Lucy Charles-Barclay, who phenomenally pushed through a calf tear at this last year's Kona to actually take the title at the end of the day. But she reveals that her mantra while she was running the last leg of Kona, she was repeating to herself, this, no pain is worse than how I will feel if I don't win this race. And so she did push through, claiming the title, but at what cost? And clearly there was a cost of having to take time out post-Kona to rehab. And so one could always have the debate, was it actually worth it at the end of the day? And I think probably for Lucy, it was most likely was worth it, but it has meant some fair disruption to her training afterwards, as it has meant that she's had to, like I said, take time out and reassess and rehab the injury, and then your training drops down a level, and you have to take a few steps back to start building yourself up again. And then we can also look at another triathlete, Gustav Iden, the 3-time world champion, who last year was sidelined due to an Achilles injury. And in his own words, he admits that he was blinded by ambition and short-term goals. So once again, that premise of just pushing through and ignoring what the body was telling him. And it has now impacted his bid for the Paris Olympics, which happens later this year. I think it hasn't put him out of contention completely, but it is going to be quite a big reach for him to get back to full fitness and to qualify for a spot. But I think, there were also other circumstances around his injury. You look at the fact that he sadly lost his mum, and there was stress and all of that goes with that kind of loss in the injury spiral. But if we look at both these contexts and both these athletes, the bottom line is that injury creates a big disruption for some people it's their careers if they are elite sporting athletes. But for the everyday athlete, I think there's just as much disruption to their lives in not being able to do what they love. And it affects all components of life. Is there a way that we can actually predict injury? Yes, there's certain things that we can do to maybe mitigate this risk of injury, but wouldn't it be amazing if we actually had some way of telling us, hang on, you need to slow down a little bit, you are at risk. But yes, we're going to get to that. But just back to Gustav Iden, I think it's really motivating just to look at his positive attitude towards injury. And I think this is really important that, coming back from injury, that you actually accept it and, don't let it get you down. And he says it's very easy to be a world champion. The only goal is basically to win again. But his ambition now is just to run a 6x1K slightly better than last week. He says it's kind of refreshing. So yes, I think when we talk about injury, we also think about your mental fortitude and your emotional resilience around getting around that. And that, can be linked back to genetics just as much as your injury risk. But that's not our topic for today, and we're not going to be delving into that at the moment. We are specifically talking about injury. We are talking about how genetics relates to injury, and if there is a way of starting to take action before real injury occurs, and so mitigating our risk in terms of what we can tell from genetics. And we welcome again Chantelle from 3x4 Genetics. Great to have you here again with us, Chantelle.
Hi Di, it's great to be back.
So yes, let's get into it. What does genetics tell us about injury?
So Di, as you said, it would be quite amazing if we had a way to look into the future and determine when or where we will get an injury. However, there is a lot of research developing, and maybe sometime in the future there will be some technology that will allow us to pinpoint exactly what type of injury we'll get and when we will get it and what's going to cause it. But at the moment, we are quite limited in terms of which tools we have and what information we have. But there still is a lot of data points that we can look at. And so there are some tools that coaches use to determine when an athlete will get injured and what types of injuries they will be prone to. And all of that, those different data points can inform whether an athlete maybe will get a certain type of injury. But a lot of those data points that we look at is quite broad in terms of the population. So some of the factors that we might consider is someone's gender or their age or their fitness level, but all of those are averaged across the population. And we know certainly that even though, for example, being a woman might increase your risk of certain types of injuries, not all women are going to get the exact same injury throughout their lifetime. So there are definitely limitations to those types of data points. Mm-hmm. Similarly, we can look at other measures such as someone's training, how quickly they're ramping their training, and we still run into the same issue there where we see that that's still a population average. Some people are able to very quickly increase their training rate and they will not get an injury at all, whereas a different individual might start training intensely at that same rate and they might get an injury. Yeah. So the question really is, what is the difference between the one person and the other person? What distinguishes us in terms of our biological makeup? Mm-hmm. And that is where genetics plays a role. So what genetics allows us to understand is from the very beginning of when someone might be starting their athletic journey, whether that's professionally or just for their own enjoyment, we can start getting an idea of what predispositions someone might have based on that genetic background.
Okay, so I guess if we link it back to when we were looking at training regimes and looking at people's genetics in terms of would they be better suited to more power type of exercises or workouts versus endurance workouts, you're saying essentially the same thing, that two people doing exactly the same training regimes are potentially going to have a different experience of injury.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. So how do we break down the genetics of injury? Do we break it down into categories? You're looking at different structures in the body. Yeah. What do we look at?
Yeah, so to understand how genetics influences your injury risk, what we discussed previously with recovery and also with endurance and power is that concept of heritability. Mm-hmm. And that essentially tells us how much of a specific trait is influenced by genetic variance in a population. So in order to really understand that heritability, we also need to understand how studies determine that number. So a lot of these studies are twin studies, and they have to look at a very specific condition in order to get that heritability. So that's why when we see a heritability estimate, it can vary from injury to injury and sometimes even from study to study, because it's very specific to that injury type that they look at, the people that they were looking at. But what we see from the literature is that the heritability of injury seems to vary from between 40% up to 69%. So the 69% is actually an interesting case. It was a study that was done in about 88,000 twins. Mm-hmm. And what they found was that for an ACL injury, that heritability was as high as 69%, which is quite significant. Yes. So as you can see, when we think about how genetics can be broken down, there are two ways that we can think about it. The one way could be looking at a very specific type of injury, and the other way we can think about it is by looking at the actual tissues. Yes. Because as those studies obviously have a very intentional reason why they have to look at a specific injury type. They can't just look at connective tissue in general. Mm. But there's a difference between the research and how we can actually apply that research.
I mean, you're talking about ACL injuries, there's obviously Achilles injuries, hamstring injuries. I mean, there's just loads of different injuries. So it does make sense to then break that down into specifics of well, sort of categories of like your connective tissue, which would be your ligaments and your tendons, then looking at, you know, muscle damage, and then potentially bone, for instance. So yes, there's genetics. So you're talking about ACL, and we can see in the research and the literature that it has been highlighted that women, for instance, are much more prone to ACL injuries. Maybe you can tell us why, but also, does gender play a big role in what our injury risk is?
Yes. Yeah, so there's certain types of injuries where having a specific, let's almost call it like an injury risk profile, will predispose you to that type of injury. And for ACL injuries, the research does show that women tend to be more prone to those types of injuries. And from the research, it seems that it's been linked to estrogen levels in women. So estrogen has an impact on your ligaments where it makes them more flexible. And so for an ACL injury, that is actually puts you at a risk. However, that flexibility, that's going to be a negative impact on an ACL injury, but for other types of injuries, it could actually be protective. So those risk factors don't necessarily always apply to the exact same different injuries. And that brings me to another way we can also think about injury risk is by looking at what are the external factors that put you at risk for an injury, and what are those internal factors that put you at risk for an injury. So an internal risk factor is, like you mentioned, your gender, it could be your age, your fitness level. And so these are all factors that we do not necessarily have a lot of control over. And inside that umbrella of intrinsic factors would also be your genetics. So genetics is something that you are born with. It's not something that you can necessarily change. But with that information, you will be equipped with a lot more handles in terms of what is my predisposition and what can I actually do about it.
What are the type of genetic tests that we can do to understand injury? So when we break it down, what do the genetics tell us about these different categories?
Yeah, so the different categories that we test for in GENEFIT are slightly different. So we don't give someone a list of specific injuries that they need to look out for, because in terms of the practical use of that, it's not going to be realistic for someone to every day open up their app and see there's this list of 10 injuries. For the one, I'm a little bit predisposed. For the other one, that's not something I need to worry about. Exactly. So you have to think about so many things. So what we did for GENEFIT to really simplify it, because what we really care about is making it as simple as possible for an athlete to understand. So we've categorized your injuries according to those big physiological groups. So connective tissue, which is your tendons and ligaments, then muscle, which will be specifically more focused on lower body muscle injuries, so hamstring injuries, calf injuries, etc. And then also bone. So bone is a genetic pathway that we look at. It's not necessarily, which we can touch on later, is not necessarily included into your injury score, but it is still something in the long term that athletes do need to pay attention to. So something like stress fractures are not necessarily something that you'll be worried about early on, but it's something that accumulates, and it's a chronic injury that will have an impact a bit later in your life as well.
I think we're going to get onto sort of interventions of what we can do to mitigate our risk, knowing our genetics. But can you just give us an idea in terms of the research? Has 3x4 done any type of research with the athletes that you have access to in looking at validating what you have put into GENEFIT? So really looking at, this athlete experienced this type of injury. This is what their genetics said. Does it tie up? Does it make sense?
Yes, absolutely. So as part of the development of GENEFIT, we had a large validation study. So within the study, we included 229 athletes, and these athletes were all from different levels of athleticism. So we had endurance athletes from more intermediate levels up until elite levels, and then also soccer athletes as well as football players. So quite a broad range of athletes were exposed to varying levels of training stimulus, stresses within their life, and then of course quite a wide variety of genetic profiles. So what we did with these athletes is we looked at their training data, which we got from their various wearable devices, which gave us insight into how are they training, what type of load are they being exposed to, how quickly are they ramping up that load.
Yes.
So we understand what external factors are acting on these athletes. Then we looked at their injury history, which we know is very important. Another internal risk factor for injury risk is whether you've had a similar type of injury in the past.
Yes.
So that's obviously something that we considered, and it also helped us to then understand if someone has a long history of injuries, what were the factors that contributed to those types of injuries. And then obviously what we looked at was then their genetic data. So within the study, we essentially had data that followed these athletes. For some of them, we had up to 5 years of training data, along with that injury history, along with the genetic data and physiological data, and we were able to develop an AI model. And what this model essentially does is it combines all of these various factors and inputs, and it allows us to understand on a specific day what is an individual's injury risk. And when we were doing the validation for this model, we looked at 2 factors to really help us understand how accurate the model is. So the one factor we looked at was the model's sensitivity. And what sensitivity tells us is how accurate is our red zone, or when we say someone is at high risk, what is the likelihood that they will actually get an injury. So what we saw for that is that our sensitivity had an accuracy of 90%. So 90% of the time when an athlete had a red alert or was indicated as at risk, they actually had an injury that occurred. So that is one part of the model, but another part that we really cared about was the specificity. So specificity tells us when the model says you are safe, are you actually safe?
Yes.
And that is also very important because we don't necessarily want to tell someone that they won't be getting an injury when they're at risk, and we also don't necessarily want to constantly give them red risks. And then obviously you can have a high sensitivity in that case, but you will constantly be crying wolf. So this really ensures that the model is usable. So in terms of specificity, we had a specificity of 75%, which indicates that when you are in the green or the low risk zone, you can really trust that. And when you're on the red, you really need to start taking steps to address that injury risk.
Okay. So, so you've got one side at 90% and then you've got the other side at 75%. And I guess someone who doesn't really know research would kind of look at those 2 numbers and say, well, why is the one only at 75%? Shouldn't it be at 90% if this model is really going to mean anything? Can you maybe just explain around that?
Yeah, so with sensitivity and specificity, there's always going to be a little bit of a give and take. So you can't have a highly sensitive model without it every now and then calling a red alert without there actually being an injury. So that risk is actually sometimes going to be, even if you are seeing that injury risk, it might not necessarily mean that you'll get an injury. And so that's why the specificity is relatively low. However, if you wanted to really push up specificity, it's going to come at the cost of sensitivity. Because essentially then you might be missing a lot of those potential injuries just so that you don't necessarily get an incorrect injury risk on that specific day. So it's a bit of a trade-off, and all models have to be developed in a way where they try to optimize as much for both. But for the GENEFIT model, obviously we want to prioritize specificity, but sensitivity is very important for us because it's so important being able to know when you are at risk for an injury. And so for that trade-off, for us it's very important to be able to indicate for someone it's time to take a step back, it's time to consider your training and look at the other factors that could be contributing to this risk.
So I think it's important just to highlight the fact that it's not, the GENEFIT model is not a predictor of injury. It's not, when you get that alert, it's not predicting that you are going to get injured. It's just saying, hang on, things are not looking so great at the moment. You need to reassess. And I think from my sort of experience as a coach, yes, we make use of data, and data is an important part of how we assess how an athlete is improving and what they're doing in their training. But I think there's the human component as well that we can never discount. And, that's always going back to the athlete. How does the athlete feel? How are they experiencing the training? If they're fatigue, their soreness, those type of aspects. So I guess what it's leading me into asking now is how does GENEFIT kind of put this all together? How does an athlete make use of all this different information and make decisions for themselves if they're not working with a coach and they're using GENEFIT as their coach? How do they put all of this information together and how do they action it?
Yeah. So as you say, it's always very important to consider, like, for yourself, how you're feeling on that day. Are you feeling well rested? Have you started feeling a niggle? And so if you maybe get a red risk on that day and you think back, like, what type of behaviors have led up into this point? Are you maybe coming down with a slight illness? Have you been ramping up too quickly? But it's also important to consider the data points. As you mentioned earlier, there's some athletes that really just want to push through an injury because you don't want to stop training. You don't want to lose your fitness. Yeah. Even just taking one day off seems so frustrating if you're making great progress. But that's the purpose of GENEFIT, is to provide you with the information that you need to make an informed decision. Yes. So I think for an athlete who's getting that red alert, to really consider, am I not feeling fatigued or am I just trying to push through it? Yes. I think that's the first place to start is to be honest with yourself. Then you can start looking at the other data points that GENEFIT is also providing. So load balance can give you an indication of whether your current training, how that compares to the training that you've done previously. So what is your current training in comparison to your actual fitness? Yeah. If you are over, that means you're starting to push yourself a little bit more than your fitness can accommodate for. Yeah. Then that might also be a sign maybe it's time to just slow down a little bit. Yeah. Similarly for under. So people sometimes think if they're training less, surely that means they're not going to get an injury because they're not exposing themselves to that training risk. But that's also quite a dangerous zone. If you have trained a little bit, if you're not training a lot for a while, your body is losing that adaptation.
Conditioning.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And then if you suddenly start training again, that could put you at risk for an injury. Yeah. So it's important to consider both sides. Yeah. The next thing that you can also look at is to consider your internal load balance, and that also will, as we discussed previously, that incorporates your recovery genetics as well. Yes. Because that's something else that we want to consider with injury, is how did we recover and how are we recovering? Yes. So your internal load balance can once again give you an indication. Are you a little bit over, not just based on your training, but also now based on your genetics? Do your muscles and your inflammatory system, do they need a little bit more time to catch up before you start ramping up further? Yeah.
And I guess this is so important because if you do get injured, for instance, and you do have to take time off, you need to know how to build yourself up slowly, and you want to be safe, but you want to be efficient and effective in what you're doing. So there's such a balance that you have to maintain. And a lot of people get that wrong and end up, exacerbating the current injury that they have, or otherwise developing something new, that is linked to the old injury. So yeah, I think I see the benefit of GENEFIT and how I would incorporate that into my coaching for athletes really starting to get a handle on their training, how it's, the genetics is incorporated into that, and just dialing into how they're feeling each and every day with the numbers, so as to make intelligent decisions each and every day for their training. Yeah. So we've spoken about what genetics can tell us in terms of what our injury risk is, but what do we do if we do get an injury alert on GENEFIT? We've spoken about maybe taking load down, resting a little bit more, looking at our recovery, but what about nutrition? that surely must be a big part of it.
Definitely. And so nutrition, the biggest impact it can have is if you start before the injury occurs,
Yes.
and quite a while before the injury occurs. But obviously this is something, when you have that genetic information, you can already start putting that plan in action. If you know, for example, you are more prone to connective tissue injuries, you can start taking steps to ensure that you support your ligaments and your tendons. And similarly for muscle injuries, you can start taking steps to address that. So on GENEFIT, when you get your genetic results, you also get some information in terms of nutritional and lifestyle steps that you can take in order to address that risk.
Okay.
So for example, for connective tissue, those individuals will really have to focus on ensuring that they have adequate collagen intake, whether that be through collagen supplementation or really starting to look into bone broth, of meals that can provide you with that easy to absorb collagen. Also for muscle, that will essentially mean that you really need to focus on providing enough protein to build up muscle. It also links back to what we were discussing with your muscle damage in terms of recovery.
Yes.
So those two will be very closely related.
Okay.
And then there are some lifestyle steps that you can take in order to prevent injuries. And that will be relating to ensuring your mobility. You spend some time on mobility, you spend some time on balancing to really ensure that you stabilize, especially for your joints and ligaments, which we know they take longer to adapt. So your muscles can sometimes adapt a lot faster than your joints and ligaments.
Yes.
And that's why people tend to get those ACL and Achilles injuries, because they're taking a while to get used to the training that you're doing.
Yes. Okay. So, I mean, I guess I think it's the same when we were talking about supplements and looking at recovery. There are so many things on the market that one can potentially include in your daily regime of supplements and, whatever you're taking to boost performance. But again, knowing your genetics makes you very targeted in what you are going to spend your money on at the end of the day. And, what's going to benefit me the most. So I think we were talking about in recovery, we were kind of filtered out all of the noise. Yes. And we could identify 3 top priorities for that particular person and what they should focus on. So is it the same for injury then?
Yes, absolutely. So knowing your genetic predisposition will also mean that you can start filtering out because there really is a lot of supplements available. There's a lot of every month it seems like there's a new trendy thing to do, whether it's ice baths or hyperbaric chambers. So, and all of these things are supported by science, but we can't realistically get to everything. So it's so powerful being able to know what can I do, what's going to have the biggest impact on my health and my injury risk. And so genetics can really help you guide that decision. And then in terms of also helping an athlete, what GENEFIT also provides is on a daily basis, you will get a card on your dashboard which will give you a recommendation in terms of nutrition or of lifestyle that will actually help you support that injury risk. And this will also be tied to your training at that point, so whether you might be needing more recovery or need to be focusing on your injury risk more. So that also takes out a bit of that guessing work in terms of what do I need to eat today, what steps do I need to take today. You can just open up the app and immediately know that there will be some guidelines for you in order something actionable and something straightforward as well that can actually make a difference. And that's how we build habits. It's very small steps over time.
Yes. Okay. Wow. So lots to think about. I think, in terms of, there's never going to be the magic bullet. There's never going to be anything, I don't think, anything that could 100% say you are going to get injured tomorrow, stop what you're doing and reassess. But I think we're coming such a long way now. I mean, if we look at Lucy and Gustav that we were talking about earlier, maybe how things could have been different for them had they had access to this type of technology. I think, if you know your genetics, there's almost more motivation for you to take action on this type of data than maybe just everyday wearable data that you're getting each and every day. Because this is something intrinsic, that it doesn't change over time, it stays the same. And this is you, this is what you need to deal with. And I think having simple information that you can incorporate into your training just makes so much sense. So yeah, thanks so much for running us through it. And I think it is quite a complex area. And again, as we spoke with recovery, and as there is with endurance and power training, injury, there is still a lot more to discover and to understand about it. And we are going to be delving into a lot more topics as we run through this all. And I'm hoping, and I think we will have next week, we're going to have a nutritional expert come onto the podcast chatting more about how nutrition can be linked to our genetics and what we should be buying in the grocery store. So that's going to be super interesting as well. But thanks again so much, Chantelle, for explaining to us in very simple terms the genetics of injury. And I'm sure we will be talking to you again in the future. But that's it for today, and we look forward to chatting about nutrition next week. Cheers for now.